to the lovely English students of St. James. This is going to be a Romeo analysis after we did our Juliet analysis. Hope you find this video helpful. Now, in a similar way to how we began the Juliet analysis, I want to look at Romeo's name. Okay, so first of all, Romeo actually comes from the word wanderer, and we realise that Romeo is in a rather liminal space, meaning he seems to exist between these separate worlds in Verona. He doesn't seem quite at home with the violent, aggressive nature that we see particularly with the men of Verona, nor does he though seem at home even within his own father's home. As we can see at the beginning of the play, he's certainly feeling somewhat alienated, possibly due obviously to the unrequited love that Rosalind has for him. And you might just want to consider how different he is from his family and friends, such as Benvolio and Mercutio. Also, it could also mean pilgrimage, and this is the obvious religious connotations, and you can link this to the religious imagery that is first used when they meet him and Juliet in Act 1 at the ball. And this could also suggest that he's on a pilgrimage and that Juliet is his true destination. We can link this to the idea of fate and the star-crossed lovers from the prologue. Another idea is that Romeo is literally translated to a person from Rome, which is interesting because obviously this play is set in Verona. And this could be linked to this almost slight alienation that Romeo feels in the world of Verona, an alienation that becomes even more pertinent when you think that he's banished after the actions of Act 3 when he kills Tybalt and he is banished from Verona. But we can consider like Romeo somewhat of like a lonely figure, a figure that, yes, has friends and family and so forth, Benvolio, Mercutio, his parents, however, seems to operate in a manner that's quite singular and quite alienated. Now, another key thing we need to look at is Romeo's Petrarchan lover, which we have done in lesson. However, let's just quickly kind of look through it again because it'll be really helpful for us to just remember this. So remember that Romeo begins the play in deep depression due to his unrequited love for Rosalind. And remember that the Petrarchan lover was this whole idea of a man wooing a woman and unfortunately having his love unrequited. So Romeo certainly fits into that. He also seems fixated on the idea of love, and I think it's very telling that we never meet Rosalind. And I think there are two reasons for this. I think part of it is the fact that the play is called Romeo and Juliet, and Shakespeare wants us to focus on the love of Romeo and Juliet. That's the lasting image that we should get from this play. But I also think that Rosalind being discussed in Act 1, being seen as a key characteristic, his love and desire and pining for her, and then when he even says to the friar, says, "Oh, is it Rosalind you're going to marry?" He says, "Oh no, Rosalind, who's she?" Essentially, I think it is also to show that the idea of love that he has for Rosalind is one that is superficial. It's one that is focused purely on possibly superficial ideas rather than the true and deepened love that he later gets for Juliet. And as I've said here, we see a far more deepened notion of love than his previous proclamations when he meets Juliet. To an extent, I'm actually going to say that Juliet restores him. As I've said at the beginning, he is conveyed in a manner that is really depressed due to Rosalind not accepting his proclamations of love and due to the unrequited nature of their relationship. And it's really interesting because actually in Act 2, Scene 4, Mercutio says, "Now art thou sociable, now art thou Romeo." And the hint here is the fact that Romeo is far more of this joyful, energetic, impulsive person rather than the melancholy, depressed character that we first meet, and that his interactions and his love of Juliet restores him back to the sociable Romeo, and it says "thou art Romeo," saying that he is now his true self. This compared to the "oh brawling love, oh loving hate" from Romeo that we see in Act 1, which is very much Romeo in the depths of his despair as a result of Rosalind's desire not to be with him. So what I'm going to suggest here is that Juliet seems to somewhat restore him back to the Romeo that Mercutio and his other friends and peers seem to know and love. Now, Romeo as a tragic hero. Romeo as a tragic hero is quite fascinating because there are certain ideas taken from a Shakespearean critic called A.C. Bradley, and he says that there are a few things that a tragic hero should have, and one of them is that he should be of noble birth. And this certainly is the case for Romeo and Juliet. Let's not forget the beginning of the play, two households both alike in dignity. The alike in dignity showing that they are of equal status and equal stature in this society. Lord Capulet even calls him a partly gentleman, quite interestingly and quite ironically, in Act 1 when Romeo sneaks into the ball. And what we see is, and he also speaks that Verona speaks well of Romeo, suggesting that Romeo has that kind of exceptional quality that a tragic hero is meant to have. Even Lord Capulet, who dislikes Montagues, cannot help but commend him and compliment him on the fact that he is seen as a gentleman. However, we do see his fatal flaw, or hamartia, you can say either one, by the way, it doesn't really matter. His fatal flaw, his impulsivity, his impulsive nature overtakes his gentlemanly attributes. And what we see is this idea of a gentleman which is meant to be calm and guarded and thoughtful. Yes, we definitely see aspects of that with Romeo, but his impulsive nature is what unfortunately causes a lot of the issues and ultimately the deaths in the play. Now we're going to focus in on this impulsivity. And one of the things I want us to look at is Romeo's use of imperatives and adverbs. I'm just going to show you two here. So he says that the friar must marry them, okay? And what we see is this kind of intensity to Romeo when he decides that him and Juliet are going to be married. Also, after the death of Mercutio by Tybalt, we get this "Fie, fairy, be my conduct now," the adverb of now. So you can easily look at how Shakespeare uses imperatives, these verbs of must and these adverbs of now, to show this kind of impulsive nature of Romeo, and that he does not ponder, he does not think. Interestingly, the friar tells him to love moderately, and what we see here is a man who does not do anything moderately. He tries to moderate his feelings, obviously, when he first encounters Tybalt, because he does not want to engage in the violence. However, the minute Mercutio is killed, he goes to a totally indifferent place. And we have this beautiful quotation, "Fire-eyed fury." We've discussed the fricative use of alliteration there of the fire-eyed fury, the conveying his anger and his impulsivity, but also the idea that this kind of fire within him, and when we consider fire, we think of passion, is what overtakes him in this moment and obviously causes him to be banished and so forth. And I'm going to leave us with a bit of a question here, just to push our thinking and to really push us to think really deeply. And that is Romeo a bit feminine? Okay. And you may be thinking absolutely not, but let's just have a think about it. And even if you are thinking absolutely not, it's important to consider another aspect of it. So, remember what we said about him being a Petrarchan lover. He speaks with this quite poetic melancholy, okay? He speaks in this very heightened manner. When he sees Juliet, as we've said in the Juliet video as well, their lines complete a sonnet, which is incredibly beautiful. Consider how he speaks of Juliet being a light. Consider how he speaks of, Juliet being the sun. All of the language for Romeo is deeply poetic and has some of arguably the most beautiful poetry in this play. He often refuses to partake in the more brash and base humour of his peers. Certainly we see Mercutio, and even to an extent Benvolio as well, encountering much more brash humour. Think of the language used by Samson and Gregory, the servants, at the beginning. Now, yes, obviously they're a lower status of Romeo, but certainly their language having this base, quite sexual humour compared to Romeo's more poetic and loving and romantic version shows that he is quite different from the other men that we encounter in Verona. Interestingly enough, he revokes his name. When he speaks to Juliet, he actually revokes his name. Now, when you consider most of the time, including today's society, when someone gets married, often it's the woman who takes her husband's name. She becomes Mrs. whatever. Here we have this idea of a subversion where Romeo is willing to kind of undertake and revoke his name and to strip himself of the identity of being a Montague in order to be in love with Juliet. And you could argue that in this moment that the gender roles are subverted. Even his suicide could be read as somewhat effeminate, by poison rather than taking the honourable idea of stabbing. Juliet's stabbing, Romans believed, in particular the Romans believed that stabbing was the most honourable form of suicide. However, Romeo decides to take it by poison, which is far more passive. And again, you could argue that those final moments of the play show again the subversion of the gender roles, where Juliet takes the more active route, whilst Romeo takes the more passive route. And I'm just going to remind us that the final line of the play is of Juliet and her Romeo, where she's almost taking ownership of him rather than the opposite. Well, I hope you enjoyed this, and we'll have more videos on other characters as well. I think I'm going to try some of the smaller characters just so that we can really broaden our understanding and our knowledge. I hope this is helpful. Thank you.